reserve in your currency. Splurge your millions buying houses like Monopoly.
Hey guys and girls, welcome to this week's episode of No BS with Birchie podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Birch, and this is a show unraveling the truth to the facade of the 21st century. We're now exiting the matrix and waking up to motherfucking reality. Today I've got I feel like I'm in a Street Fighter or something, like principal place, a residence versus investment property, units versus houses, right? It's a showdown, which is best and what is the best for you. So today there's three parts that I'm going to talk about. One is, should I build properties and develop them, or build a property portfolio? That's section one today. Section two is, should I buy a principal place, residence, or an investment property? And number three is, should I buy units versus houses? So as always, I don't give financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. I can help you with financial advice. You can hit us up at B.Invested.com.au and put a request through to my team and maybe book in a discovery session, which is for free. See if someone in my team can help you with your journey wherever you're at, whether it be financial, finance, accounting, your super fund, whether it be managing your assets, whether it be growing your portfolio. We can help you at all different points in your journey. But today, this is just general discussion and no financial advice. So the first discussion of this week is, should I build a property portfolio, or should I buy a block of land and do a development, or knock it over and build a duplex, or whatever the case may be? So that's a good question. I get asked this a lot, actually, and it was random that I was just having a chat with one of my team members, and they said that it was a question that had come up 3 times today, which is really interesting because I hadn't really heard this question for a long while. So, should you build a property portfolio or buy a property and develop? Firstly, as I always say, right, you need to work out, what are your goals? What is it going to be that you need to get you there? If you've heard my previous podcasts or been on a map session with me or watched any of my webinars, you'll hear occasionally I'll talk about, how do you travel to Perth? And in short, it depends what vehicle you need, depending on where you're going and where you're trying to get to. So if you are trying to build a wealth, you need to work out, are you trying to build passive income or active income? These are questions you need to be asking yourself to be able to make that decision. So maybe it could be a thing where we grab a pen and do a write-down session and write down the pros and cons of both options. So if you are, doing a development, there's some pros to it. So you can buy a property, flip it, and make some money. What does that money look like? You could, sort of make 100 grand, 200 grand, 300 grand, 400 grand, 500 grand, whatever the figure is, you could make some chunk cash. What is the negatives? Well, there's risks surrounding that. There's things that do go wrong. The development may not get approved. There could be a delay. There could be issues with builders. There could be issues with council. You've got 12 months, 24 months of no income coming through. Getting the lending for that could be a bit of an issue. What are you going to do with the property once you finish with it? Are you going to retain it, or are you going to sell it? So let's assume that we are trying to do a development and we're in 2019 and we're doing a development in Sydney. We go buy a property, let's call it a 500 grand property, and we go build a duplex for 600 grand. So it's $1.1 million you're into it for. You sell the things off and you're going to sell them for sort of 800 grand, 700 grand a duplex. So that means that you're going to come with a total figure of 800, let's say one's 700, one's 800, there's $1.5 million worth of value, and you're into it for 600 plus 500, so that's $1.1 million. So there's a total profit there of $400,000. 400 grand is perfectly fine to make. That's a great income to make for a period of 1 or 2 years. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need to look at the whole picture. So if you were to buy do that deal, there would be holding costs. That could be, 10 grand, 20 grand, 50 grand. I'd probably estimate, holding a property and doing that sort of development, maybe like 50 grand to 100 grand over that period of time. So your 400 grand now goes down to 300 grand. You'd have stamp duty for buying the property. You would also have real estate agents for selling the property. which could be, maybe another 50 grand. So you're down to 250 grand. And then you'd have to pay some capital gains tax on top of that. So who cares? You make 200 grand, 250 grand. That is a pretty good result for doing, 2 years of your life. At that period of time, you've been also living your life, doing your job, whatever it is that you do on a day-to-day basis, and you've got this result at the end. There is no shame in making money on that front. However, if we look at what happened over that period of time, you've also missed out on 2 years of the market. Your servicing has been tied up. And what else could you have done with that same outcome? So if we flip the page over and look at what we could do with a property portfolio, there's a reason why I buy assets, and I'm not a developer. I will be a developer one day, so don't get me wrong, because there is good money to be made out there. But there is a lot of other opportunities which you can make lots of money for. I am not a fan of money. As you all know, I think that our currency is dying. Our money that we have is buying us less and less. 200 grand, if you would have made that money in 2019, wouldn't buy you what $200,000 would in 2021, which is when we're doing this. So the simple part of the currency erosion, I'm all about building wealth, not about money. So you need to work out what are your goals and what are you trying to achieve. So if you do that first option, you'll make 200 grand, 300 grand, but that might mean that you at that period of time, you sell it. You're now sitting in 2021. You've got your 300 grand, which is great, as I keep saying, but you've got no assets. You've got no property because you've sold the asset off. So you're back to square one with zero property, and then you have to do that same trick again, and you're becoming an active investor rather than a passive investor. So my goal as an investor is that I'm a bit of a lazy fucker. I like doing things, I like growing, but I don't want to get caught up in all the little, I don't want to have to keep doing the same thing over and over again. That's why I went down the road of building a cash flow stream, which will give me that day after day, week after week, year after year. So the second option is, let's say, for instance, on the first option, you go to the bank, and we didn't factor in anything wrong with your servicing, with lending, or anything like that. When the banks do lending, they look at things very differently between whether you've got cash flow or not. So if we've got the property which is vacant for 2 years whilst you're doing the development and stuff, that's going to hurt your servicing. So you might only be able to borrow to buy that $1 million property. But at the same time, if you went and bought 10 $200,000 properties, you could possibly buy $2 million worth of property, because you don't just have your income that's coming in to service the debt. You have now got 10 tenants out there earning an income and then paying their income to you to live in your property. So you could have $300 a week times 10 properties. That's $3 grand a week. That's 150 grand a year coming in. So in the 2 years that you've had all this cash flow coming through, which is also helping the bank service your position in order to support that portfolio and continue your journey. Whereas in the other one, you've had to physically be going out there working, paying off that mortgage or servicing that debt without any cash flow. If you owned the property outright on the development, then we need to factor that in as the opportunity cost, because you could have used that same amount of money to purchase an asset which is giving you a cash flow position each week. So if we look at a building a property portfolio perspective, what is the pros and cons? The pro is that you've got recurring revenue, you've got cash flow coming through each week, you physically own the asset moving forward. You could possibly extract equity. If you buy it well and structure the portfolio well, you could use the deposit for number one to buy number two to buy number three to number four, and build a nice asset. Another positive is because of the recurring revenue and because of the equity potential, instead of just buying $1 million worth of asset, you could have $2 million worth of asset. And that's very important. And look at the cons of building a property portfolio, then you're not necessarily getting that big chunk of cash. So if you were to sell the property and do a flip like we were talking about beforehand, you would have a property where you might be making a chunk of 200, 300, 400 grand. However, this would be supported via having the portfolio if you could have a portfolio that's going to be bringing you equity. So there's lots of pros, like the stuff that I'm thinking about as I'm talking about the negatives here, because you've got the ability that you can continue to have growth and all that sort of stuff. But if we're looking at the negatives, there's a short list of negatives, like, you're relying on capital growth. What happens if the tenant destroys the place? What happens if something goes wrong? What happens if you have a hot water system go wrong? Whatever the case may be. So there is some cons to that. However, the pros are much higher. My biggest thing when I'm looking at building a portfolio is, what is the property going to do? And I'm a big fan of having a hybrid version of this, where you've got both things going on. So for me, like, if you go out and buy your first property, which is a development, I think that there's a lot of risk because you may or may not know what you're doing. But B, all you're doing is selling the asset and getting pieces of plastic with dead criminals printed on it, which is our currency, our money that we're using. You are just comparing that property. You're not valuing the actual asset underneath. You're just buying into the fact that you want to get some money from the system that we're using in, that we're participating in, which is the economy. Whereas if you look at it from a holistic approach, like working out what it is that you're trying to achieve. If you've got a property portfolio that's bringing you in, say, 50 grand a year, you could have that 50 grand come in today. Next year, you have another 50 grand come in. The year after, you have have the 50 grand come in. The year after, you have 50 grand coming in. So you've got that reoccurring revenue, which is going to support your lifestyle. So you don't have to physically go out there and do another development, because you know that the cash flow position is going to be coming through. So for the con, that would be a more slower and boring and simpler approach. However, the most important reason as to why I like having the portfolio instead of the singular property is that if you went to 2019 and then fast forward to 2021, and this could be any period, there's heaps more pros and cons to both of these, but I'm just looking at it, very simplistic. You would be simply buying a property, building the property, selling the property, making some money, and then putting that in your bank. You've got all these costs, all this risk that's surrounding, what could go wrong, builders' margins and all that sort of stuff. But you don't have an asset at the end of the day. So you're sitting here in 2021 with 200, let's call it 300 or even 400 grand in the bank, but you don't have any asset. In that time, the market could have gone up or it could have gone down. If you have that portfolio, let's assume that you bought it for $200,000 per property, and the market went up a little bit and it went from 200 grand to 300 grand, then you would have had 10 times 200 grand properties, which is $2 million. And if it went from 200 to 300, that means that $2 million portfolio would have turned to $3 million worth of asset. Therefore, making yourself $1 million worth of net worth position. For me personally, I find that, poor people and my mindset when I was poor, I used to look at making money and selling my time for money. Money was an object back then. It's not anymore. It's just an illusion. It's a part of the system. And trying to save money. So make money and save money. So it's selling my time, saving, so I don't have to lose some of the money that I've got. However, building wealth, and I think that wealthier people look from a different perspective. They're looking at their net worth position and what is happening to the net worth position, and they're looking at cash flow and how they can manage that. So I talked about the fact that, we've got the property that you've developed. You bought it for 1.1, you sold it for 1.5, you made 400, you paid all these bills, you end up with 200-300 grand, 400 grand in your pocket, whatever it is, and that's the end of the story. You've got no asset, nothing's gone up. You've bought the portfolio, it's 2 million, it's gone to 2.5, 3 million, whatever it's done, it's gone up. But what we haven't looked at is that you still own the asset. Would you rather double in the next 10 years a zero property portfolio to zero, or would you like to build a $2 million portfolio and it double or triple and go from 2 mil to 4 mil, 4 mil to 6 mil or 8 mil, whatever the case may be? What is the end goal of what you're trying to achieve? So looking at it from a cash flow perspective, we've seen inflation push everything up in price, and it's only just started. Like, we're going to see a lot more inflation due to the level of money or currency that they're printing in the system. If we're seeing a lot more inflation, that's not just the property price that'll be inflated, that will be the income that's inflated. The $300 a week rent turns to $320, and then it goes to $340, it goes to $350, $380, $400. So the rental income goes up as well. So if you're looking at a year one perspective of 10 grand a year, 20 grand a year, 50 grand a year, whatever the cash flow is, if you can compound the growth of that rental return due to inflation, then you're going to see your income continuously grow, and your money that you've made and you've had to pay tax on and all that sort of stuff is losing its purchasing ability. So in year one, you might make 10 grand on your rents. But if you push up 10 rents by $20 per week, that's $20 times 10, that's $200 per week. 52 weeks is $10,400. So let's call it 10 grand. If you have that portfolio, then in perpetuity, you just keep pushing that rent up every year by $20, just as a hypothetical, of course. Then this year you're getting 10 grand a year rent, next year you're getting 20, the year after you're getting 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 grand. In 10 years, could you be getting 100 grand a year passive or 200 grand a year passive? What would that be able to buy you, and what would your 200 grand have bought you back 10 years prior? So they're the things you need to look at. For me, how I see it working through is having a strategy. Everybody's position is different. The vehicles are very different. You're using, yes, a property as a wealth generation tool, but one is an active income and one is a passive income. What I like to look at, and this is how I've designed my portfolios, is a point where I will pay down the little bit of debt that I do have left over now. I could either sell off a couple of my properties in my portfolio and just be happy with it, or I could do some development, sell off some of the properties, generate some growth, and then use that profit to either build more properties in my portfolio or pay down the debt and remove that debt from my position. So looking at it, is it just one strategy that works for you? Is it the other strategy that works for you? Or is it a combination of both? Like, I see a lot of people that go, okay, we're going to build a $2 million property portfolio, and then we want to pay down the debt. How do we pay it down? Working like a dog, paying all your money into taxes, and trying to pay off a debt of $2 million isn't really the smartest thing to do, because the debt today is so cheap, it doesn't really cost you much to have it. So if you had $1 million, you could pay off $1 million debt. So if you had $1 million loan at 3% interest rate, that's 30 grand a year. You get another $1 million and you go, okay, you've got two options. You can either pay out that $1 million loan and save yourself 30 grand a year, but at that point, the money goes poof, back into money heaven, and that debt disappears, but now you've got that asset which will only go up. Let's assume it's $1 million just for the fun of the exercise. You've now got $1 million asset which could go up, could go to $2 million. Great. But if you kept that $1 million, you could either pay out the mortgage, or you could buy another $1 million worth of asset, and let's assume that it's got a 7% return on it. That would bring in 7% of $1 million would be $70,000 per year. 70 grand a year, you could take 30 grand, pay it against the other property, and then there'd be 40 grand left over. So your cash flow position would be much stronger. So you can see how, money can be used in all different ways, but the strategy is very important. The kicker, if something like that was to occur, is that you'd have the initial $1 million worth of asset, then you build the extra $1 million worth of asset. Now you've got, if the market was to double, instead of 1 million turning into 2, you've got $2 million turning into 4. So your net worth position is growing, your cash flow position has the opportunity to grow, and you've got many more options. So, I guess as an investor, you need to work out, are you an investor? Are you trying to be a developer? What is your game? What are the risks? What is the outcome you're trying to project? And what do you need to do to get to the best end goal position for you? For me, I couldn't think of anything worse than buying and selling properties for 10 years, 20 years, and not owning properties and just having a couple of dollars that I made over the years. You might feel cool, right? There's nothing wrong, as I said, with making a few $100 grand, but you continuously have to perform that trick. And, there is a lot more risk because you don't own the asset. And, simply like you're paying a lot of taxes, you're paying a lot of, people along the way, real estate agents, stamp duties, all that sort of stuff, lawyers, and you don't have any assets. So that's just my view on that. Should you build a portfolio or should you build a property? That's just a bit of my weight on that discussion. The next discussion, should I buy a principal place of residence or should I build a property portfolio? I often think of this one as if you had a $500,000 today and you wanted to buy a car, you could go out and buy yourself a Lambo. Most people say, I'll buy a Ferrari if I win the lotto, right? So we're just going to use this one just for the fun of it. If you were to go out and spend $500,000 on a Lamborghini tomorrow, you would then need to find the money to pay for the insurance, pay for the rego, pay for the servicing. That would require further cash flow. How would you pay that? You've just spent all your $500,000 on buying the Lambo or the Ferrari or whatever it is. At the same time, with that same $500,000, you could use that $500,000 to go buy yourself 20 Ford Falcons for $25,000 a piece. You could rent them out to be Ubers, collect the cash flow from renting them out as being Ubers, and use that cash flow to go buy yourself a Lamborghini or a Ferrari or whatever it is. And then you're going to be like, how do I pay for the servicing? That's okay, I've got more cash flow coming in from those Ubers. So you can pay for the servicing and pay for the rego and pay for the insurance. And then you go, oh, maybe we can go buy a boat. Maybe we can go do whatever. But, that's how I look at property. So for me, when I first started investing, I could have bought a mediocre house, which would have been a red brick shitter in Sydney, and it would have been gobbling up negative cash flow a lot, and I could have lived in that property, and I could have been, I guess, happy by society's expectations of me, but that wasn't going to make me happy. That wasn't my end goal. So for a bit of delayed gratification, for me, I built a strategy, and I used the property as a vehicle to get me the properties that I want. So I live on 40,000 square metres of land in Sydney, and I've got multiple of these properties in Sydney, which I will develop in the future. At the moment, I'm just happy living in them. Not many people have farms in Sydney, but I used my property portfolio in order to get me to where I wanted to be. So with that, if you were to go out today and buy, and there's no right or wrong answer to this one, if you wanted to go and buy $1 million property, you would have to pay that mortgage yourself. If you felt sick tomorrow, you'd have to get up and go to work and sell your time to pay for that debt. If you didn't want to go to work, if you wanted to travel, you'd have to get out of bed and work out a way to pay that mortgage. If you bought 5 properties for $200,000 a piece, that's still $1 million. But with that five properties and $1 million worth of asset, you would have 5 tenants having to get up every morning, hopping in the train, getting to their job, earning some money, coming back home, transferring it over to your property manager, getting that money into your bank account, and you've got 5 tenants working for you, paying you rent every week. So instead of you paying for one mortgage, you've got 5 tenants paying you passive income, and you're minimising your risk because you've got 5 rental income streams paying for a mortgage, which is giving you surplus cash flow rather than you working like a dog for 30 years, stuck in a white Camry on Parramatta Road, in traffic, for an hour a day, trying to pay for the mortgage that you don't even really like the house of. So for me, when I first bought my first principal place residence, I actually sold my first property overboard just for the fun of it, and I used the profit to pay for the deposit on my principal place of residence. And I went and pushed up the rents across all my other properties to pay for the mortgage. So the mortgage was about $1,000 a week as interest only. And I think it's about maybe $1,000 a week now with principal and interest repayments. However, I think it's about $1,200 a week now, principal and interest, because the interest repayment came down and then the principal kicked in and the mortgage is paying itself off. But looking at that decision, either I have to get out of bed now and I have to earn $1,000 a week every week to pay for my mortgage, or I could just put up 20 rents by $50. $50 at 20 is $1,000 a week. Or I could put up 100 rents by $10. I could put up 200 rents by $5. I could put up 50 rents by $20. Having the asset base, I can now control what I want in my life and what I don't want in my life and how I want my life to be. And ultimately, that's why the slogan of B.Invested is called Live Life on Your Terms, because all I've done is replace the need for me to have to go to a job to do what I want, when I want, how I want. And they're the choices that you need to make. I think that it's very important to look at things holistically when making decisions. And probably half of my investors that have helped out over the years have been tenants, and I've built them a roadmap to get to owning their own house. So and they don't have to pay for it. So sometimes people come to me, they've got a property and they want to build an investment portfolio. Sometimes people come to me and they've got no properties, they can't afford a house, and they just want to get started. Sometimes I've got people that go, I can't afford the house that I want to rent vest. There was no such term as rent vest. I actually don't know who created the term rent vest back in the day. There's a couple of people that I know. One person I know, which is great, his name's Chris. Chris Gray, he's out there. Shout out to Chris, hope he's doing well. But I know he talks about rent vesting a lot, where he goes and talks about renting where you want to live and buying where the cash flow is better. So when you're buying a principal place of residence, the other thing you need to factor in is what is the cash flow going to look like. If you were to buy your dream home today, would it cost you $1 million or $2 million? Let's assume it was $1 million property, but for you to rent that property is only $600 a week or $500 a week. That would mean that property would be sort of $600 a week, 52 weeks, 30 grand a year. 30 grand a year over $1 million, it'd be fairly neutral cash flow given the low interest rate environment today. But at the same time, if you had 5 properties bringing you $300 a week, that would mean that you got $1,500 a week coming through. So the rent from your tenants would be paying for the rent for the house that you live in as well. So I guess there's many ways to make things happen. Ultimately, it needs to work best for what your goals are and what your strategy is and where you're at in life. Like, are you married with children and you want to have, stability and all that sort of stuff? They're the pressures that society puts on us, and you've got to work out what is, important at your point in your life and, what works for you. So once again, there is no right or wrong, but if you can use that portfolio to get yourself in your dream home and make other people pay for it, that's certainly what I'm most excited about, is that I live life on my terms and I'm not stuck and forced into anything else. Final topic for today is units versus houses. So a lot of people ask me, Nathan, I want to buy a house, and I look at this very holistically, and it started back in maybe like 2005 or something. When I met my broker, that was maybe like 16 years ago. I'd been buying properties for a couple of years, bought a couple of houses. I only ever wanted to invest in houses. And I went to my broker and said, I want to buy like a 7th property or something like that. And she said to me, Nathan, you can't get the loan for it. It was like a 230 grand property I wanted to buy, house that I wanted to buy. And I was like, really? I want to buy it. And it's like, no, you can't service. And I was like, okay. I knew nothing about banks back in the day. Now I need to know everything about a bank, because they're the ones giving me the money. So I want to know, what can I do to get them to give me more money? That's the ultimate thing. So I was sitting there and I was like, shit, I can't buy a property for 230 grand. It was renting for like maybe $200 a week or something like that at the time. It was in Sydney back in the day. And I found a townhouse. It was like 130 grand. Some idiot had paid like 300 grand for it beforehand. It was probably worth 200 grand. I was like, this thing's really cheap. I want to take a punt on it. Never buy townhouses of that, but I asked my broker, can I buy this property? And she said, yeah, Nath, that's fine, go buy it. And I was like, okay, cool, that's interesting. I got a cheap one. So I bought it, and then another one came up in the block a couple of months later. And I thought, shit, I'd love to buy a second one because that one worked out all right. And I went back to my broker, and she said, yeah, that's fine. And I was like, hang on a second. You told me I couldn't buy a property for 230 grand going back a few months ago, but you just let me buy 2 properties for 130 grand each. That's 260 grand. Like, what's going on here? And she turned around and said, well, you've got 2 rental incomes now, so the bank's going to like that. It's going to help with the servicing. I was like, hang on a second, that's right. I was going to get $200 a week for 230 grand, but I've got like $170 a week or 160 or 180, whatever it was, Now I'm getting 2 incomes of that. Now it's like 320 or whatever the rent was at the time, 350 combined, whatever. And I looked and I was like, right? The banks required me to have the extra cash flow, so that's what helped me get the next one. And then I sort of treated myself out of the position I was at because I was buying these properties with positive cash flow and a few things that had worked in my favour at the time. Interest rates were dropping and I was able to borrow some more money. And then I realised that each step along the way, and I've talked about this previously in the motivation and the mindset episode. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it. It was the previous episode of this. The importance of working out and recalibrating who you are and how you want to get to the next level. Because I could have sat there and gone, I was all too hard, or I want to have a house, or the unit's better, or the unit's worse, or whatever. All my opinions didn't mean shit. What ultimately is important at the end of the day is that I have assets which go up in value. Do houses go up more than units, or do units go up more than houses? I'd have to say over all these years, I've seen the same growth on units as what I have houses. So one hasn't outperformed the other. But the difference is if I could have $1 million of house that doubles to $2 million, or if I could have $2 million worth of units that doubles to $4 million, I want to have the largest asset base that's going to double and grow in size. So if I've got 2 houses bringing me in $500 a week, or if I've got 5 units that are bringing me in $400 a week, I've got a larger cash flow, I've got a larger asset base, and I can get more bang for my buck, and I can grow my asset base quicker and larger and better off by buying that thing. There's no, there is pros and cons for both of them. Some people say, I like having a house, I can build on it, but really, how many people go and knock down their house in order to build another property? Very few. And once again, you need to work out, are you a developer, are you an investor? If you're a developer, then maybe. But if you're an investor, what are you trying to do? I've spoken to people, they go, potentially, one day I can do a subdivision and maybe build a granny flat. Like, really, how much does a fucking granny flat cost you to build on a property in 2021, right? A granny flat could cost you 100 grand, 120 grand, 140 grand. With the cost of rising inflation out there, it's costing more and more to build every year. So you're overcapitalising on the one property by building a secondary dwelling. We could buy a whole new asset. Like, I can pick up properties in 2021 in Brisbane for 120 to 150 grand to rent for 250 a week. So it takes me back to, what is the best value and how am I going to build this portfolio out? And, at some points in my portfolio, I've gone from, only having houses to having sort of 70% of my properties were units, townhouse and villa. And now I'd probably say maybe 40% of my properties would be townhouse, unit and villa. Maybe 25% would be just houses. And from a commercial perspective, I've probably got about 15% of them, acreages and large land banking. So that would be to about 80%. And then probably 20% would be some weird and wacky stuff, like whether it be motels or shopping centres or little strips of shops, offices, or other sort of commercial interests that I'm into. So, looking at the portfolio, it's holistic. But at the time, I bought, once again, the properties that I needed to get me to my end goal and the end outcome. And I think a lot of people get too fixated on a property rather than looking at what the big picture is. So let's assume that we're going to go on that journey again and we're going to fly somewhere. Do we hop on the aeroplane? An aeroplane ain't going to land at your house. So, do you hop on the aeroplane to get to the end destination, or do you need to get a taxi to the train station, a train to the airport, the plane to the other side? If you don't hop on the smelly cab that you have to hop into, then you're not going to get to the airport. If you don't get to the airport, you're not going to get to the end goal. So you need to work out where you are on the journey and what vehicle do you need in order to get yourself to where you want to be. And that question about houses versus units, whatever the fuck is going to help me get to where I want to be is what I'm going to be driving in. So it all comes down to the finance, understanding what the finance strategy is and knowing how to get there. So on a final note, if you do need help planning that strategy, if you do need help in generating a strategy that's going to help you get closer to your goals or getting a bit more clarity on that front, you can contact our office on 1300 367 925 and book in a thing called a discovery session. You can have a chat with one of my specialists and look at your position of where you're at, what options there are, speak to my team of experts, and see how we can amplify your portfolio and put you closer and closer to your goals. If you need 10 properties to retire, 5 properties to retire, 20 properties to retire, most people get stuck at 1 or 2. So it's not about getting 10 or 20 today. It's about getting 1 or 2 and then working out how to get number 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 6 and 7, 8, 9, 10. And as you're building out that portfolio, you're going to need different things along the way. So if you want help on working out a plan of attack or realigning where you're at, do call my office, have a chat with them, mention that you've heard this on the podcast today, and ask for a free discovery session, which is what I'm giving out with my team of professionals today. 1300 367 925. And as always, you can listen to the No BS with Birchie podcast every Tuesday. You can head over to B.Invested.com.au if you're interested in getting started or need some guidance as where you're at currently with your property journey. And as always, we're now on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, so go check it out. Catch up soon and see you on the next show.